Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you all can see my screen. I hope you all are having an amazing day. As mentioned, I am Keisha Jones. I did get I guess a title change that I meant to share. I'm now the Vice President of Student Affairs. Same job, but we didn't have vice presidents prior to my president. I had a president that passed this past summer, and we just got a new president, and so she shifted some titles. So same job, just different title. But nonetheless, I'm super excited about being here and talking about the work that I do across the system and at Davidson Davie. While I'll spend most of my time talking about what I do at the system, I feel it's important for me to include what I do at my college because that does influence a lot of the work that I do across the system. And what I do across the system influences the work that I do on my campus. So I will make sure that I do that. Just to kind of talk about what I'm going to review today, I'm going to give a real brief overview of the North Carolina Community College system for those that may not know, and a little bit of information about Davidson Davie so that you'll know, in thinking about equity and thinking about the work that I'm doing, the types of populations that I'm working with when I think about the colleges and kind of where they're situated and the communities in which they serve. And then I'll talk about the work. I will talk about what I do at Davidson Davie because really that was the catalyst to even get me in the role that I have with the system office. And so that has sparked a lot of the work that I do across the system and a lot of what we do on our campus, because I do think we're very intentional and strategic about our work, influences what I do when I go to other campuses. I'll talk about some strategies for success that I've implemented for the state, for all 58 community colleges that I think can, is a foundation that anybody could take and kind of implement in their spaces. Talk about challenges that I see across the system when I think about the work that's being done. And then what are some of our success stories or things that I feel like these are things that are moving the dial a little bit in our equity initiatives. I know Melissa gave a little bit of information about me, but just to kind of give you, well, why is she able to do all of these things, right? Sometimes we want to know, hey, where does she come from? But I've been in higher education for 19 years. Really, in August, it'll be 20. I've worked in 2-year and 4-year institutions in North Carolina and in Georgia. All of my community college experience is in North Carolina, but I've worked at a 4-year in Atlanta, Georgia. I worked at Georgia State, and I worked at North Carolina A&T. So worked in higher education for quite some time. At Davidson Davie, I serve as the Chief Student Services Officer, so I oversee all of student affairs at my institution, but I also have the great pleasure of leading our equity initiatives for our campus as the Chief Diversity Officer. That's a title that was added to my other title this past summer, but I've been leading our work on our campus for about 6.5, 7 years, so they just gave me the title to go along with leading that work. I've been in a leadership role of the 19 years I've been in higher education. I've been in a leadership role for 18 years. So I'm very passionate about leadership. And I think leadership and inclusive leadership and authentic leadership is extremely important in thinking about DEI and DEIB efforts just in general. And thinking about DEIB and how long I've been in that space, I really would say probably the whole time I've been in higher ed, I've been involved in DEI in some shape or form. When I started my education, it was called the Ethnic Concerns Committee, was the committee that I was on. It wasn't Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. It was the Ethnic Concerns Committee, was the first committee that I was on when I very first started working in higher ed. But same thing, I also serve as an adjunct instructor. So I've taught at the community colleges in which I've worked in either student success courses or my master's degree is in counseling. So I have taught in our human services department, advocacy, and those kind of things. Thinking about industry, I've worked with nonprofits. I've sat on boards with nonprofits. I'm currently doing a community needs assessment for a nonprofit in Southern Pines. So I do a lot of DEI work with nonprofits across North Carolina. Did a lot with workforce development as a part of some of my roles in higher education. I do own my own business, so it seems like I don't have enough time to do anything based off of everything I've just listed thus far. But I do have my own business where I help industry, nonprofits and institutions of higher education with their DEIB efforts, as well as leadership and emotional intelligence and stuff like that. So that's a little bit of background for me. Now, what I like to do before I jump into presenting is take time to do introductions and really allow you all to engage in a way that you don't normally engage when you think about some of our icebreakers that we do, right? Or even when you first meet someone or you have casual conversations, a lot of times we don't dig deep. So at Davis and Davy, there's a game that we play whenever we come together with some of our equity initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's called the Culture Wheel game, and it's basically diversity, inclusion, and belonging in action. It was developed by Social Designs. Jada Monica Drew, she's a woman out of Greensboro that does a lot in the DEIB space, but it's a game that she's created, and it's a way to get to know each other. So what I'm going to do, and we're not going to take a bunch of time, is I'm going to put you all in breakout rooms. Now in the chat, I only shared it. I shared it to the wrong person. Hold on. Didn't share it with everybody. In the chat, I'm going to drop the same instructions that you see on the screen. I'm going to drop that in the chat. And if you can download that, I will put you in breakout groups. What you're going to do is you're going to follow the directions that's on the list. There are several options, and I put a couple of options on the screen, but the sheet that's in the chat has more options, but you're going to pick one or two, just depending on the time, and you all are going to take some time to get to know each other in a different way. One of the reasons why we use this activity at Davidson, and I actually use it in a lot of presentations and things I do on campuses, is it's another way to get to know people. When we think about when we are first meeting someone, or even when we interact with some of our colleagues, sometimes our conversations can be real surface, especially if it's not someone you're comfortable with or someone that you don't necessarily know. And if you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it really is about understanding who people are, what makes them who they are, because it explains why and sometimes how they respond to certain things. And sometimes, especially in the busy worlds that we function and operate in, we don't take that time to like really get to know people and understand who they are, what their character traits are, and what are the things that make them who they are in the spaces in which we work. And this particular activity allows you to do that. And so I mentioned at Davidson, we do this at a lot of our equity related workshops that we have, and it is something that now many of our employees, if we don't play it at the beginning of a meeting, they want to know why, because they've been able to learn so much about their colleagues that for some of them, they've worked with them for years and never knew many of the things that they've learned through these conversations, and it's helped them have a better understanding of who they are, a better understanding of why they may respond to things the way that they do. And so I think this is just another way. So I like to do that before I get to talking about a whole bunch of other stuff. So thank you all for engaging with me. So now I'm gonna jump into the presentation. So I'm gonna talk a little bit, give you a little bit of a backdrop of the community college system, then Davis and Davy, and then I'm gonna jump into the work. So if you're not familiar with the North Carolina Community College system, we have 58 community colleges in North Carolina. We're one of the largest community college systems in the US. We service the 100 counties in North Carolina. So if you think about where our institutions are located, a citizen in North Carolina is about 30 minutes away from a community college. The mission of the community college is really about getting people from where they are and getting them to where they want to be. So the idea is that we are located in different spaces throughout the state to ensure that we can provide that access to them. So in the North Carolina Community College system, there's something called the North Carolina Student Success Center, which is where I am housed in my role as the Director of Equity. So I talked about, kind of what my roles are at Davidson, but I split my time between Davidson Davy Community College and the North Carolina Community College system. So I'm the VP at Davidson and the Chief Diversity Officer, but for the system under the North Carolina Student Success Center umbrella, I'm the Director of Equity. And that means I service all 58 community colleges related to their diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging efforts. Thinking about Davidson Davy, Davidson Davy is one of those 100 counties. We service 2 counties out of those 100 counties. We service Davidson County and Davy County, hence the name Davidson Davy. community college. We are in rural North Carolina. Davidson County is a very large county, whereas Davie is a little small, but Davie is a more affluent, wealthy county compared to Davidson. I like to say that Davidson County is still segregated from a school system perspective. We have city schools and we have county schools. Our city schools are where our marginalized low-income families attend, and then our more affluent families go to the county schools. And the same thing kind of with the funding structures when we think about how those schools are supported. We have 13,000 students collectively, when we think about curriculum students, continuing education students, our adult high school students, but our curriculum students is about 3,700 students. We're a predominantly white institution with 65% of our students being white. And I am the only person of color in an administrative role at my institution. And thinking about our faculty makeup, we don't have many full-time faculty of color at my institution. And that is the case amongst many of our community colleges in North Carolina. Our strategic initiatives, and the reason why I put this up here is because it really impacts our work, but is really around champion learning, prioritizing our relationships, may they be internally or externally, building our partnerships specifically with our community partners, may it be workforce development or our K through 12 partners, and then investing in our future and what does that look like from a global perspective. The reason why I put that there is because many of us, when we think about our strategic plans, equity is one of those strategic initiatives. That's not how we did our strategic plan. Equity is integrated as an objective or a goal within each initiative. And that's something that I recommend for most institutions, because a lot of times when we just have one equity goal, sometimes it's hard for people within your institution to see that they see their place. And then sometimes somebody may be responsible for that equity. Maybe your chief diversity officer is responsible for that. And then it's not integrated into the fabric of your campus community. So that's one of the reasons why you don't see equity as a strategic initiative. But if you were to look at our plan, equity is integrated throughout, and it's also a part of our mission and our values at our institution. So in thinking about my work and thinking about how I do my work, so Davidson Davie is my primary job, and where I spend I would say where I spend most of my time, but not really here lately. But nonetheless, and thinking about our work and how we do our work at campus. So one of the things I think is extremely important is for your institution to have an institutional why you do this work. Why is this work important? Because when you have an institutional why, it drives your how. Generally, we have a how that drives our why. And so when you're thinking about getting people to buy in and having an understanding of what is the purpose of us doing this work, because unfortunately, it being the right thing to do isn't sufficient anymore. Is not enough for some people. So saying that this is the right thing that we should be doing for our students and our stakeholders may not fly and may not get you far. And so being able to sing the same song so that when you are combating resistance or trying to get people to understand, having an institutional why is extremely important. And then everything that you do drives back to that why. So again, your how should be leans from your why at the end of the day, and not necessarily your why leaning from your how. And thinking about our structure and how we do our work, we have an equity steering committee. I'm the chief diversity officer. Everyone at Davidson Davie knows that it is not my sole responsibility to ensure that equity occurs on my campus. I ensure that things happen and the things that we say that we're going to do actually happen on our campus, but it is the role and the responsibility of every individual that works at that institution. And so we've tried to create structures and ways that people can find themselves in the work. One being the strategic plan. If you think about your strategic plan and how your strategic plan should function and operate from your institution, everything that we do, any policy, program, purchase, anything that we're doing should always tie back to your strategic plan. So when you're thinking about buy-in and getting people to see themselves in the work, we should all be able to see ourselves in the strategic plan, or at least align what we do back to that. So that's our first way of kind of ensuring that this goes beyond just a chief diversity officer or beyond leadership. But then how are we leading the work? Because it's not my sole responsibility to do that work. And so we have an equity steering committee that I chair. Well, I actually co-chair it with my CFO. The equity steering committee is very heavy leadership. A lot of times when you think about initiatives, we say that we need to do a bottom up because we want to have buy-in. So we want to make sure that people that are in the trenches are, a part of the conversation. But I'm going to disagree from a DEIB perspective. This is a top down. You have to have leadership commitment. Leadership has to state that this is important, why this is important, be able to tell the story, actively engage in it, because we are a society and a world of, and if you think about emotional intelligence, we operate from what we see, right? So I like to say, if I have a happy supervisor, I got happy staff. If I have an overwhelmed supervisor, I have an overwhelmed staff. It's the same thing when we're thinking about initiatives and things that we are engaging in. And so the Equity Steering Committee is very heavy leadership driven. Majority of President's leadership team is on that Equity Steering Committee because the Equity Steering Committee determines what our equity goals are. They determine from an institutional perspective what our institutional why is, what are the things that we're going to work on, what are the things that we are going to be addressing each year. And so we don't have time to have a group of people having a conversation that have to then go back and ask permission for certain things, right? We get that permission and get that stuff done. And so we are an authoritative type of committee, meaning we have authority to make decisions and move things forward. My CFO being my co-chair is very intentional. I do not have a budget for the work that I do. I don't need a budget because I got the CFO who got the whole college budget as a way for us to do our work, right? And so how do we think about everything that we're doing on our campuses is related to equity. So all the dollars that come into the college should be able to address our diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging work that we do. So having that structure and being able to have that dialogue and her having that understanding has allowed us to do a lot of things with me having absolutely no budget, but still being able to bring people to campus, offer certain professional development, things of that nature. So in addition to that, we also have what we call equity champions. And equity champions are individuals across campus who stated, hey, I think this work is important and I want to be involved in accomplishing the goals. And so we do a call a couple of times a semester to all faculty and staff and ask them, hey, do you want to engage in the work? And they say yes. And so we meet with our equity champions on a monthly basis. We do professional development, but then we also have them in working groups where there are different things across campus that they work on. So in thinking about how we do our work, we have areas of discovery. So in thinking about this work, you can't accomplish everything at one time. So you have to be able to break that work up in some way, shape, or form. So we have areas of discovery that we focus on. And the first is, well, they're not in any particular order, but environment is one, policy and procedure, curriculum, co-curricular programming, marketing, faculty staff, hiring and retention. And then there's one other one, but I can't think of what it is off the top of my head right now. But that's how we break up our work. That's how we identify what we're working on. That's what the working groups within our equity champions groups, that's what they work on. And so the very first thing that we did was environment. And it really was saying, hey, looking at our environment, what do you see? What don't you see, in a sense of creating a sense of belonging? And one of the things that I'm very happy when I think about Davidson compared to other schools is that we called out who our population we were going to focus on. Because if you think about the work and you think about how many of us do the work, we like to do things for all students. And that's fine. I mean, we work in institutions of higher education and we are there to support all students. But the thing that I try to remind people is that when you do something for your most marginalized population and you move that to scale, it impacts everybody at that institution. And we, as institution of higher education, we like to generalize things. And sometimes that puts us in a place of not really addressing our equity gaps and addressing the issues that we have on our campus because we don't want to make people uncomfortable. By saying, I need to focus on this group, or, we talked about I've mentioned the strategic plan. We may say, hey, we want to hire more X. You want to hire more what? What does your data say? What is your data telling you about that? So in thinking about how we broke up our work and how we do our work, we really identify that, hey, students of color are going to be our our first focus of students or populations that we're going to work on, when everything with those different areas of discovery, everything will be focused on students. So from an environment perspective, through the lens of a student of color, what do you see? What don't you see? If you are in an interest, or you are already enrolled, or you are at a space of completion, what do you see? What don't you see? When you're thinking about creating that sense of belonging through our policies and procedure, looking at our policies and procedures through an equity lens, and looking at that through an equity lens from a student of color, based off of the policies and procedures that we have in place, what are the implications for our students of color? From a faculty, staff, recruitment and retention perspective, thinking about hiring employees of color. You know, what are the messages we are communicating? What is the historical context? If you're not familiar with North Carolina, you're not familiar with Davidson County in general, it has the historical context of that county is rooted in KKK. So what does that mean for a person of color coming to that institution? What are you doing as an institution to be able to disrupt the historical context to get people to still be interested? And so in thinking about how we do our work, that's how we break up that work. And that's how the Equity Steering Committee and the Equity Champions really get to a place of trying to move things forward. An example of that, when we first did our environmental scan, we look through the lens of a student of color. If you're not familiar with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Completion by Design Lost Momentum Framework, it is a framework where you're looking at a student's experience from interest to completion. So we use that framework and had specific questions. And we probably had our equity champions go through and do that work. And we probably had 15 pages of things that we needed to change at the college, just based off of that one activity. An example of that was in our health sciences department. If you would go in, you would see all of the nurses that graduated from the program. I'm gonna say from like 1970 to 1985, because they were black and white pictures. And so when you're thinking about looking at a lens for a student of color, and you're thinking about creating a sense of belonging, you got to think about intent and impact, right? So the intent was, oh, we want to be able to demonstrate and showcase all of the nurses that graduated from our program. The impact at our community colleges with our nursing programs, they're limited enrollment programs. You have to go through a very rigorous process to get into our nursing program. And then for many of us, we only have about 25 or 30 seats a year. And so if I'm a student of color and I go into that building on a campus tour and I see all of the pictures were of white women. So if I'm a student of color and I go in there, what is the messaging that I'm communicating? It could be nothing, but it also could be that, oh, people that look like me don't get into those programs. Or if they do, we don't graduate. Or even for a male, regardless of your race, maybe you all don't accept men in those programs. So understanding what is the messaging that you're communicating with the things that you're doing. So that's how we break up our work, and that's how we are, I think, intentional and strategic with our work. It goes beyond professional development. It goes beyond cultural awareness events. I think a lot of people, when you think about the work and you think about doing this work, they hang their hat on hosting a bunch of professional learning activities or a bunch of cultural awareness events to build cultural competence. And unfortunately, that's not what DEIB work is. Those are components of things to educate people, but it's bigger than that. How do you begin to have impactful change in the spaces in which you operate and you function, beyond me saying, hey, as a faculty or staff member, I want you to go to this professional development? Because ultimately, how are you holding them accountable for what they learned in the professional development? How are you ensuring that they are applying what they learned in the professional development? Is it optional? Is it mandatory, right? And so really kind of thinking those things through. And through that, then we identify what our goals are. When we think about our goals are pulled from our strategic plan. We do not create goals that people feel like, hey, oh, this is one more thing I have to add to the work that I'm doing, or this is one more thing that I have to do. Ultimately, you should be, everything you're doing, again, should tie back to the strategic plan. So we try to utilize that as a method to ensure, one, we are accomplishing what we put on our strategic plan, but two, also understanding that we're not asking you to do anything that you wouldn't already be doing when you think about this. And then again, getting people to understand that equity is integrated in everything that they do. And thinking about the image that you see on the screen, this is somewhat of like what we call our organizational structure for equity work on our campus. It's not its own division, but we want people to have an understanding of how everything has to tie back to what the Equity Steering Committee has identified as our goal. So regardless of what area you're in, so like EC is our equity champion, CTL is our Center for Teaching and Learning, SALT is our student affairs leadership team, HR's human resources, IR's institutional research, ALT is academic leadership team. And really, how do all of these different places and spaces on campus, how do what you do circle back to our ultimate goal at Davis and Davie when you think about what our institutional why is and the work that we're doing. So that's just a quick overview of, kind of what we're doing at Davidson. And now I'm going to kind of go into what I do across the system. And I gave that as I guess, a foundation, because a lot of that is kind of how I lead the work. So I mentioned earlier that I am the director of equity for the North Carolina Student Success Center, which is housed in the North Carolina Community College system. And what that means, again, is that I offer diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging support to all 58 community colleges, whatever that looks like for them. That could be professional learning. I may go and host professional learning sessions. I've done a lot of our colleges have professional development days where they close and do professional development for their faculty and staff. I've done a lot of keynotes for that, or just in some cases, I've done the whole professional development day for them and kind of catered professional learning opportunities based off of what they have going on within their institutions at that time. I do needs assessments where I will go into an institution and assess their current efforts and then provide recommendations on how they can improve or enhance what they're already doing. And then I have what I think is my favorite piece of it is the Equity Coach Academy. So the Equity Coach Academy is a year-long program that I created and facilitate, where I teach people across the system on how to do equity work on their campus. And the fall is in person, and so it's an in-person event where in the fall we meet monthly for 2.5 days. And I have a curriculum that I've created to kind of talk to them about how to do this work on campus, how to work with resistance to change, what is coaching and what does that mean and what does that look like within your institution. They, of course, get foundational things related to equity. We've talked a lot. We're in North Carolina where we have some legislative things. And so we've talked about that. And so the colleges have to commit to their employees participating. So there's an application process, there's a fee associated with it, and then there's a commitment that comes from leadership. I am an avid believer that, commitment comes in the form of money and resources, and sometimes resources, not money, resources, time. And so the presidents of the institutions have to commit to provide a commitment letter or recommendation letter for their employee to participate, but they also have to agree for me to come onto their campuses and do a needs assessment and then talk to them about how to integrate what the equity coach has learned into the fabric of what they're doing. And so we are in cohort 3. The first 2 cohorts were very different than the cohort that we have now. We just went to this year-long model this year. And that really stemmed from people saying we got some really good information, but implementation was a little bit difficult for us when we got back to our campuses. So this is me working with them and their leadership team at their campus on how to integrate what they learned and then ultimately assess kind of what they're doing and provide recommendations on how to integrate this work. In addition to the Equity Coach Academy, those individuals that are trained, I also utilize them in my state work. And so in addition to being the director of equity, I'm also an equity coach to some colleges where I am coaching them on a project that they have and ensuring that that project is being looked at through an equity lens. So I do hire those equity coaches to do work beyond their campuses and support the work that I do across the state, because I am only one person in this 58 community colleges, and I get called to be at a college on a regular basis to do something. And so right now, my equity coaches are assigned to a project that we're working on in North Carolina called REACH. It stands for Racial Equity in Adult Credentialing in Higher Education. The focus of that is on adult learners who are Black, Latinx, or Indigenous students, and ensuring that we are creating pathways where they can get on and off our ramps, but also holistically supporting them and creating culturally sustaining environments where they thrive. And so equity coaches are assigned to those colleges to ensure that the pathways that they are creating, the holistic supports that they are implementing or assessing, and are being looked at through an equity lens that may require some policy review being looked at through an equity lens, and then really talking to them about what does it mean to create culturally sustaining environments where these students can thrive in those spaces. And so we have trained, I think I'm at 54 people across the state, different colleges that we've trained in that space. And I probably have about 10 of those 54 that actually work with me on the work that I do across the system. I talked a lot about the professional learning, but I don't just do professional learning at the institutions. Through the North Carolina Student Success Center, I host monthly professional development sessions based off of various topics that the colleges state that they want. And it's not always about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging specific. Like February was all about basic needs and servicing students' basic needs and holistic supports and things of that nature. March is going to be about teaching and learning. All of them, of course, with some type of equity lens added to it. But I also try to provide professional learning to the 58 about the different things that we're working on or challenges that we're having. The biggest thing for me is about how do I be proactive instead of reactive and thinking about the work that we're doing. Like we're doing a lot around AI and how that impacts. We've had a series around that is like, I think we do 3 or 4 sessions a month around AI and how to implement that. And then I've mentioned this already, but just regular consulting services, whatever that looks like. I've worked with Board of Trustees. I've worked with students. When you think about the different efforts and how you involve student voice and how do you get students in focus groups and things of that nature. So, and thinking about my role from a system perspective, many of us do not have chief diversity officers at our institutions. A lot of our colleges primarily utilize DEI committees or task force or steering committees, whatever the titles may be, but that's kind of how they drive their work. And so I come in and I provide that support to make sure that everyone is in a space of understanding how to do the work and have a foundation. The project that I'm currently working on is an inclusive excellence framework, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So strategies for success, I think I've hit on this a little bit in thinking about the Equity Coach Academy, but I do think it is a great way to get more people across our system to understand the work, understand how to do the work, and be able to help facilitate those conversations on campus again, because many of our institutions don't have chief diversity officers. And so how does that work? And then the equity coaching, as mentioned, right now they're working on the REACH project, but we assign them to various projects. So we are guided pathways colleges in North Carolina. And so thinking about guided pathways and how do we integrate equity into that, and how are we ensuring that the things that we're doing from that perspective have an equity lens. And then the last thing is, so in North Carolina, we have some legislation that relates to DEI. And so what I have done for all 58 community colleges is created a toolkit. So I have interpreted our legislation, which is Session Law 2023-62. I have interpreted that for our system. I work with our general counsel at the system office. I interpreted it, and then she looked at it to make sure that my interpretation of the law was correct. For the most part, it was. And from there, I created a toolkit and a session, like a professional learning session, where I am talking to institutions about how to integrate the legislation into their current DEIB efforts. I felt it was very important for me to do that because I didn't want people to look at what's going on in other states and have a chilling effect to where it's like, out of fear, I'm not going to do anything, or out of a lack of understanding, I'm not going to do anything. And so I probably trained about 300 people thus far. The toolkit is about a 60-page toolkit, has FAQs. I did a call to action to all 58 community colleges saying, hey, what is it that you don't understand about the legislation, or what is it that you want to know about the legislation, and responded to those. I provided case studies and scenarios of different things as it relates to the legislation and its impact on campus. I provided a communication plan to campuses. One of the things that I think we do not do well in higher education is communicate, even though we think we do amazingly well in that space. We don't always communicate well. And so I provided them with a communication plan on how they can communicate what was happening and what the changes meant for their institution. I am a SACS reviewer, so I was able to go back and tie some things to SACS and give them like some of the standards that apply to DEI, even though it doesn't necessarily have DEI in it, but what are some of those SACS standards that allow you to continue to do the work? HR is a big component of our legislation. So what are some things that your human resources department should really consider when you think about job descriptions and questions and things like that that you ask? Instead of telling you what type of professional learning, because North Carolina's legislation focuses on what you offer in professional learning, instead of telling you what you can offer, I told you what you can't offer as it relates. So it's a pretty extensive toolkit that really allows colleges to continue to operate and function the way that they have. I have, sent messaging and communications out to all of the presidents across the system, just so that they are aware this is out here. This is a resource for you to utilize on your campus. And this is how you can integrate that into the work that you're doing. Just a little quote: remembering that equity is the journey, not the destination. So in the work that I do is something that I think we will be working on for quite some time in the state of North Carolina. And so really trying to make sure that people understand that this is a journey, not always a destination. And so we're going to have some challenges and things that we are going to have to work to overcome. But my role as the director of equity is to ensure that they have a resource to be able to have those conversations. So in thinking about overcoming challenges and just thinking about, the themes and things that I see across the system and things that I see across the state is leadership consideration. So one of the things that I challenge you to think about from your campus perspective is think about how a change initiative operates and functions at your campus on a regular basis. Mine is DEI. Don't take DEIB out of the equation. Any change or anything that's going on your campus, what does that look like from a leadership perspective? May it be upper administration, middle management, whatever the case may be. What does that look like? What does accountability look like? What does conflict resolution look like? What does difficult conversations look like? Right? So if you are at an institution where you all really don't hold people accountable, or you struggle to hold people accountable, or leadership may struggle to hold people accountable, you don't like uncomfortable conversations, so you kind of skate around those hard topics, those uncomfortable things, or conflict resolution isn't really something that is used, or people don't like to engage in it. Now I want you to add on top of that something as controversial as diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging in 2023. You're not going to move that work. And so sometimes I think we get into the place of this is the right thing to do, but not having the understanding that the leadership that we have are not in a position or a place to really be able to lead the efforts, because in regular terms outside of DEI, they don't hold people accountable. They don't like having uncomfortable conversations. So what are those leadership considerations? So one of the things that I'm stressing, because it's a theme that I see, whether it be at upper administration or middle management, is really having an understanding that you all have to have a common goal when it comes to the work that you're trying to do. You also have to be transparent and honest about where you are as an institution and how your institution moves forward change. We do not like to be honest and realistic about the spaces that we're in, because we want to say that we're doing great things. And for many of us, we are. But you have to be honest and transparent about your institution, where your institution is, instead of being in a space of of hoping that we can get to a place. Yes, I want you to hope that you can get to a place, but be realistic about where you are and what is the gap between where you are and where you hope to be, and how do you plan on filling that gap. And sometimes it's not doing a professional development session on what is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Sometimes it's doing a professional development session on how to have crucial conversations, looking at your emotional intelligence, looking at inclusivity, inclusive leadership, looking at your inclusive bias just as an individual person. So sometimes the way that we operate with this work, it doesn't sink in, or people don't buy into it because of the way that we just operate and function as a college as a whole. We don't look at that. We don't look at where we are as it relates to the 4 stages of organizational change in the work. All of those things are important because they help with the next thing, which is navigating resistance to change. People don't like change, but a lot of times people don't like change because they don't understand what you're doing and why you're trying to change, because you haven't articulated what your institutional why is. So that's extremely important. And then making sure that the things that you are doing, that you are able to measure the impact and then sustain the momentum. If I think about the legislation and I think about some of the things that come, it has really put people in a position to say, you know what, we can't talk about that. And that's not what the North Carolina legislation says. It does not say that at all. There's a misinterpretation of what that legislation is saying we can and cannot do, but it's impacting our ability to move forward. It's impacting and it is perpetuating that resistance to change, right? And so those are some of the barriers that I feel like we are facing in the work. So thinking about success stories, I will continue to pump up the Equity Coach Academy. I think it has been a great resource for our campuses, and the new structure of the way that we do the Equity Coach Academy, where I'm actually going to campus. I do 3 visits in the spring and really meeting with presidents and meeting with their leadership team and the equity coach, meeting with their DEI committee, meeting with other people on campus, and really thinking about, hey, how are you doing this work? And then how do you integrate what these individuals have learned in an effort to do the work? And then thinking about the larger picture of the North Carolina Community College system, I can use those same people to work on the various initiatives that we have to ensure that equity is integrated into the things that we're doing across the system and not something that's an add-on. The success story is the legislation. I think North Carolina is the only state that has interpreted the legislation the way that I have interpreted for all 58 community colleges. So instead of leaving the colleges to a space of trying to figure it out, let me figure it out for you. Let me help facilitate those conversations. Let me be the one that is kind of helping you review your current processes and the current way that you do your work. And is that in alignment with what the legislation is saying, right? So that we don't get into a place where we have this chilling effect across North Carolina and we stop doing the work, because we need to continue to do the work for the students that we service. And then the last thing is I'm working on an inclusive excellence framework for all 58 community colleges. While I think that because all of our community colleges are located in different communities and they serve different populations of people within those communities, there's still a foundation that colleges need. And there are many wonderful frameworks out there on how to do this work. The thing that is a theme across North Carolina, and I do a lot of work outside of North Carolina, is how to get started with the work. I think sometimes we think hiring a chief diversity officer or putting together a committee is how you get started with the work. And then that's how we get caught up in, well, let's do a bunch of professional development and cultural awareness events. But so this inclusive excellence framework is really getting to a foundation of how do I even get started? What are the most essential things that I need to do in order to ensure that this work is sustainable within my organization? And then with that, I provide some of those wonderful frameworks on how to do the work as a part of that. But this is more about how do I even get to a place of intentionally and strategically doing this work at my institution within my organization. So in thinking about some final reminders and things that you should consider or should be considered, and we try to consider across the state, is again, the importance of leadership. This is a top down. This is not a bottom up. You have to have leadership commitment. Leadership has to be involved in the work. Leadership has to be integrated in the work. And this is not just through lip service. This is through action. Like, they are heavily involved in decision making, and they are engaged in the conversations. And you kind of know what their stance is, right? Whether they are for something or against something, it's important for you to know that, so that if you are someone that's in the midst of the work and doing the work, you know how to lead the work based off of where your leadership sits. The other thing is making sure that you're being strategic and holistic about your approach, and making sure that this is integrated in all facets of your institution. And if I can't stress this enough, the work that we do should not just be for our students, it should be for our faculty and staff. If you are a faculty or staff member and you do not feel a sense of belonging or inclusivity at your organization, it is very difficult for you to do that for a student. I cannot create a sense of belonging or create an inclusive space in an environment where I don't feel like I belong or I am included. I may be able to do it, but it may not be authentic, and I may struggle with it, right? So making sure that the efforts that you're doing is for all your stakeholders and not just your students. Even though I know we are here for our students, you also have to support your faculty and staff and your other employees at the institution. And then understanding the power of communication and collaboration. If I think about the work that I do across the system, again, another theme is communication. People don't know what's going on. We don't celebrate our wins, big or small. We don't always communicate what is going on, how we're doing the work, why we're doing the work. People on campus are not singing the same song, right? When you think about the work and making sure that there's a unified voice about why we're doing the work. And then collaborating. The one thing the Equity Coach Academy does and brings to the system and to those that have engaged is a network of individuals that may have some of the same struggles, may be having some of the same issues, but it gives them a space and a place to be able to come back and say, hey, you have an expertise in this, can you help me with this? Or I'm having this challenge. So it gives them a space to collaborate across our system and across the different counties in which we serve in North Carolina.